So the cancel culture is after George Whitefield now. They're wanting to cancel George Whitefield. I knew this wasn't going to stop with the Confederate statues and monuments and all. It's not about that. It's about something much bigger. And so, have you seen this? They're wanting to tear down or take down the statue of George Whitefield at Penn. Apparently, they're at Penn University in Pennsylvania. There's a statue of George Whitefield. It's a 100-year-old statue that's put there. I think for his 200th birthday or something like that. But and they're taking that down. George Whitefield, if you're not familiar with George Whitefield, he was not a Confederate soldier. He lived long before the war between the states. He lived before the Revolutionary War. He was an evangelist, a gospel evangelist in the colonies in New England. And, well, throughout the colonies, American colonies. And they wanted to cancel him, of course, now, just like everybody, cancel everybody. And so I was kind of interested in that. And a friend of mine asked me if I'd read a biography by George Whitefield by Thomas Kidd. Thomas Kidd's a historian, professor at Baylor over in Texas, and I hadn't read it. And so, and I'm kind of like that. Somebody mentions a book, I ask the question, and I can't just say, no, I hadn't read it. I couldn't get it out of my mind. I'm like, I wonder what's in that book. I wonder what's going on. And with the statue and everything. And so I kind of have a problem. I couldn't just let it go. I had to read it. There might be a 12-step program about the problem I have. But, and so anyway, I got the book and read it. And it was good. I'd never read a biography of George Whitefield before. I was familiar with George Whitefield, of course. But I don't think I've ever read a biography by him. Some of the things that I knew about George Whitefield were, of course, that he was a itinerant evangelist during the Great Awakening. So he had some connection with Jonathan Edwards, which I love Jonathan Edwards, and love reading Jonathan Edwards and his writings. By the way, my son actually used to live in Northampton, where Jonathan Edwards was, and my son was a student at UMass Amherst, and he lived in Northampton and worked at a coffee shop straight across the street from Jonathan Edwards Church. So it was pretty cool. It's not the same building. They have the building that Jonathan Edwards preached in is gone, but they have a newer building. I think it's like 250 years old. But whatever the case, I've been around in that area and everything. That's where Jonathan Edwards was, and George Whitefield up there as well, and all through the colonies. So I knew a little bit about George Whitefield preaching during the Great Awakening. I knew he had some interaction with the Wesleys, especially knocking heads with John Wesley, theologically speaking, because George Whitefield was a Calvinist, and John Wesley, of course, was Arminian, and so they didn't see eye to eye on that, even though they were good friends. They did have heated debates with each other, so I know about that. But the main thing, that George Whitefield is known for is his preaching. Is going around preaching. His voice apparently was very demanding. I remember reading about, even before the biography, reading about one reporter saying that people were just moved to tears by the way Whitefield would say Mesopotamia. And large crowds. He would preach a lot of times outdoors to like 10,000 people. He knew how to project his voice like that, and probably select places, that were sort of natural amphitheaters. And so I knew about that, about George Whitefield's life, and also his connection with Benjamin Franklin is famous. Benjamin Franklin was not a believer, was not a professing believer. He did have a Christian worldview, just like everybody else back then, but he was not a professing believer, and I know that Whitefield would give him the gospel and tell him about his sin, that we as human beings are sinners, that we have rebelled against a holy God and deserve a punishment from a holy God. But God in his love came to earth in the person of Jesus Christ, lived a sinless life, and died on the cross to pay the penalty for sin for all who would repent of their sins and trust in him. And so Whitefield would urge Franklin to turn to Christ, and as far as we can tell, he never did. But there was not only a friendship, but a business partnership, because as you probably know, Ben Franklin was a publisher, a printer, and he would publish and print George Whitefield's material. And so I knew several of those things about him, but I did not know that he was a slave owner. And that's of course why they're canceling him, because he was a slave owner, and they say he was instrumental in bringing slavery into Georgia, the state of Georgia. And so I really didn't know anything about that part of the story, and so I picked up Thomas Kidd's book on George Whitefield, and I was very interested. It's a very interesting book. It's very engaging. Really filled out a lot of things about some of the things that I knew that I didn't know about George Whitefield. For example, I said I knew about his confrontations with the Wesleys. I didn't realize how controversial he was at the time. He did especially early on in his life. There were some things in some of his theology. You can read the book to hear about it, and some of the excesses that Jonathan Edwards talked about during the Great Awakening was attributed to some of the things George Whitefield seemed to be fanning, and some other things that was real controversial. And you think social media now is cutthroat and people say nasty things? Man, back then they were publishing, printing stuff against each other, and so some of that was pretty interesting. They even had a play that was a parody and a mockery of Whitefield during the time. You would go to a play, and it was, there was a lot of controversy around this guy, as well as he was extremely popular. Like I said, 10,000 people would come and hear him preach sometimes, and they would come from miles and miles around to hear him speak. Kidd tells one story about him having to be, it was in a building, and it was so packed, they actually had to hoist Whitefield through the window to get him into the building so he could preach. I thought that was pretty interesting. And so you have a lot of those kinds of things. And so the controversy, his interaction with Benjamin Franklin, that he was more, a lot of a sort of a, I don't know if Kidd uses the term marketing, but marketing of himself, and which is kind of, should he be criticized for that or not? And Kidd was very, I think, generous in giving a balance, because some people have criticized him for it, and he kind of took up for him. It wasn't really that he was trying to market himself. He was wanting to get the gospel out, and so that was good. But as far as the slave consideration goes, that I had never heard of before, Kidd deals with that. Dr. Kidd deals with that in the book, and probably, I would assume, because I'd never read any other George Whitefield biographies, I'm assuming some of the older biographies kind of just whitewashed that, no pun intended, and didn't really deal with it. And Kidd tried to deal with it as much as he possibly could, all the information that was out there, and I thought that was interesting. But he was fair. I kind of, because I don't know Thomas Kidd, to be honest with you, I was assuming that he was gonna throw him under the bus and just trash him, and he didn't. He didn't. He didn't try to exonerate him completely either. He was very fair and balanced. I think he seems to be a very balanced historian, just giving the facts and kind of explaining some things and realizing, because a lot of people, slavery is a hot topic today, and they just assume that every slave owner was this beaten people and everything, and there's no evidence whatsoever that George Whitefield ever abused any of his slaves. It was just part of the culture that goes back thousands and thousands of years. Every culture on the planet pretty much has enslaved people, and there's been that in slavery, and so the colonies were no different than that. And the book goes into that a little bit, and it just explains what he was doing. He was not an abolitionist, but there wasn't very many people who were total strict abolitionists in the early 1700s in the colonies, and so that explanation was there. So apparently, what it was that Whitefield employed slaves in his orphanage in Georgia, which I don't think I knew about that, but it was a huge part of Whitefield's life and his passion. Had this orphanage in Georgia. I thought was very interesting part of the story. And so Whitefield had slaves there, and especially later, he had more slaves than orphans at one point. Also, another part of his life, he bought a plantation, fully operational plantation that had slaves as an investment to raise money for the orphanage, because that was his real heart. But Kid took great pains to point out that he never, abuses slaves. We don't have anything that like that. And actually, I'll tell you, one of the most interesting was that Phyllis Wheatley, who, if you're not familiar with Phyllis Wheatley, she was a famous poet during that time period, slave girl, black African slave girl, who was a poet. And a very popular poet in those days. And so this one I didn't know. Her first poem was written about George Whitefield. And so that was very interesting to me, I guess, because I like Phyllis Wheatley's poetry and everything. And so that was pretty interesting to me. And she praised him for preaching the gospel to white people as well as black people. So that was an interesting little note. There's a lot of interesting little things. I told myself I was going to be short on this book review, but long story short, recommend the book. If you like biographies, if you like that time period, I think it's a helpful book to an interesting book, and he's a good writer, a very good writer, engaging. It's not a dry history of just facts. It's a very engaging book. I think is helpful and interesting, and so I would recommend it. And by the way, before I go, this is only the second book review that I've done here on YouTube, and I'm thinking about doing some more. And so, if this is interesting to you, I only have a few subscribers. If you subscribe to my channel here and click like on this video, that'll tell me that there's somebody out there that's interested in some book reviews. I read, I don't know, 1, 2, sometimes 3 books a week, and I'm thinking maybe every Friday, just posting just off the cuff like this, just off the top of my head, finish reading a book and say, hey, this is the book that I read this week, and it's interesting, and I can recommend it if you would like it. And so click those things if you'd like to see some more book reviews. Thanks.